You've been influencing your life without realizing it through attention, emotion, and expectation, not effort. What feels like coincidence is often feedback. When your inner signals are scattered, life feels chaotic. When they're aligned, reality responds clearly. This isn't mysticism. It's how perception shapes outcomes. Most people move through life assuming they are reacting to reality, when in fact, they are continuously participating in its formation. Every thought you linger on, every emotion you normalize, every expectation you carry, shapes how you interpret events and how you respond to them. Over time, these responses solidify into patterns. Those patterns don't stay internal. They express themselves through behavior, decisions, timing, and the kinds of situations you repeatedly find yourself in. What feels unpredictable is often just unexamined momentum. When awareness is absent, the system runs on autopilot. Old beliefs guide perception. Perception guides action, and action reinforces the same beliefs. From the inside, this loop feels like chance. From the outside, it's remarkably consistent. The key insight is this: your influence doesn't come from forcing outcomes, but from the state you habitually operate from. Reality doesn't respond to what you say you want. It responds to what your nervous system treats as normal. That baseline, your default emotional tone, your sense of possibility, your underlying expectations, acts like a filter through which experience is shaped. This is why surface-level techniques often fail. You can repeat affirmations while still embodying doubt. You can visualize success while bracing for disappointment. In those cases, the deeper signal contradicts the surface intention, and the system follows the stronger input. Not because it's hostile, but because it's coherent. It mirrors what is most stable within you. Once you understand this, responsibility replaces superstition. Not blame, clarity. You stop seeing life as something that happens to you and start seeing it as something that responds to you. The relationships you attract, the opportunities you notice, even the way obstacles appear, are influenced by what you expect to encounter and how you meet uncertainty. This doesn't mean you control everything. It means you are always contributing something, and contribution becomes influence when it's consistent. When your internal signals are fragmented, outcomes feel noisy. When they align, cause and effect become easier to trace. Awareness is the turning point. The moment you begin observing your own patterns, how you interpret events, how quickly you assume outcomes, how your body reacts before your mind explains, you interrupt the loop. From there, change stops being about chasing results and starts being about stabilizing a different internal reference point. That's where real shifts begin, not through intensity but through coherence. As awareness grows, another layer becomes visible. Alignment is not just psychological, it's physiological. Your body is not a passive container carrying thoughts around. It is an active participant in how reality is interpreted and responded to. Long before a thought finishes forming, your nervous system has already decided whether a situation feels safe, threatening, possible, or closed. This is why intention alone is rarely enough. You may consciously decide what you want, but your body reveals what you expect. Tension, shallow breathing, chronic vigilance. These are signals of anticipation, not desire. They quietly shape how you move, how you speak, how long you persist, and how quickly you retreat. Over time, they influence outcomes more reliably than motivation ever could. Alignment begins when the body and mind stop sending mixed messages, when your thoughts move toward expansion, but your body remains braced for impact. The system stays divided. That division creates internal noise, and noisy systems don't transmit clear signals. They default to familiar patterns. Coherence is what resolves this. It's the state where thought, emotion, and physiology point in the same direction. Not perfectly, but consistently. In coherence, the mind becomes clearer because the body is calmer. Decisions feel simpler because fewer internal arguments are running in the background. Action stops feeling forced because resistance is reduced at the source. This is also why change often feels subtle before it feels dramatic. The first shift is internal, breathing slows, reactions soften, attention becomes steadier. From the outside, nothing looks different, but internally, the baseline has moved. And once the baseline changes, behavior follows naturally. The mistake most people make is trying to fix outcomes without stabilizing the system producing them. They chase confidence while remaining tense. They pursue clarity while overstimulated. They demand results from a nervous system that is still operating in protection mode. The system does what it's designed to do: preserve the familiar. When alignment deepens, effort decreases. Not because ambition disappears, but because friction does. You're no longer fighting yourself. Energy that was previously spent managing internal conflict becomes available for perception, timing, and precision. This is when opportunities feel easier to recognize and responses feel more accurate. Nothing mystical is happening here. A regulated system processes information more efficiently. A coherent internal state produces cleaner decisions. And cleaner decisions, repeated over time, reshape experience. This is the foundation most people skip, but it's where lasting change actually begins. Once coherence becomes stable, something else starts to change. The way you relate to uncertainty. Most people experience uncertainty as a threat. Their system tightens, their thinking narrows, and their behavior becomes reactive. In that state, perception collapses. Fewer options are noticed, fewer signals are interpreted accurately, and life appears more limited than it actually is. Expectation plays a critical role here, not as wishful thinking, but as a background assumption about what is likely to happen next. Every system operates based on prediction. Your brain is constantly anticipating outcomes and adjusting behavior accordingly. When those predictions are rooted in past disappointment or fear, they quietly steer you toward familiar results. This is why people often repeat the same patterns, even when circumstances change. The environment shifts, but the internal model doesn't, and the system continues to select responses that confirm what it already expects. From the inside, this feels like bad luck. From a systems perspective, it's probability following habit. When expectations begin to shift, the effect is subtle but powerful. You don't force optimism, you simply loosen certainty around negative outcomes. That alone widens the field of possible responses. The body stays more open. Attention becomes less defensive. Timing improves because perception isn't rushed by fear. At this level, influence isn't about making something happen. It's about reducing the internal constraints that prevent different outcomes from emerging. You're no longer trying to override reality. You're allowing more of it to register. Small changes in expectation compound. A slightly calmer response leads to a slightly different decision. That decision alters feedback. The feedback updates the internal model. Over time, the system reorganizes around a new baseline. What once felt rare starts to feel plausible. What felt unreachable becomes familiar. This is where sudden shifts appear to others. From the outside, it looks like things just started working. But nothing appeared out of nowhere. The probabilities changed because the internal assumptions did. Importantly, this process can't be faked. The system responds to what is embodied, not what is declared. Pretending to expect better while remaining internally braced doesn't move anything, but genuinely softening resistance does. At this stage, effort gives way to precision. You act less, but each action carries more weight, not because you're trying harder, but because fewer internal forces are pulling in opposite directions. What changes first is not the world, but how available you are to it. At a certain point, further change doesn't come from refining technique or increasing effort. It comes from releasing the need to constantly intervene. This is where many people misinterpret surrender. They assume it means disengaging or lowering standards. In reality, it's the opposite. Surrender is what allows a well-aligned system to function without unnecessary interference. When control dominates, the system tightens. Attention becomes narrow. Every outcome is monitored, judged, and adjusted in real time. This creates pressure, and pressure distorts signal. Even clear intentions become diluted by urgency and doubt. The system is no longer responding to the present moment, but to imagined futures it's trying to manage. Letting go doesn't remove influence, it removes friction. Once coherence is established, excessive control becomes redundant. The internal state already contains direction. Interfering with it introduces noise. This is why overthinking often blocks progress rather than accelerating it. The mind keeps reissuing commands that the system has already received. In a surrendered state, action still happens, but it arises differently. Decisions feel timely rather than forced. Responses emerge from awareness rather than reaction. You remain engaged, but not contracted around results. This allows the system to adapt dynamically instead of rigidly following a pre-planned script. Trust plays a functional role here. Not blind belief, but confidence in the internal alignment you've built. When trust is present, the nervous system stays open under uncertainty. That openness allows information to be processed accurately. Signals are read instead of resisted. Opportunities are met rather than anticipated with tension. Importantly, surrender stabilizes consistency. When effort is driven by anxiety, it fluctuates. When it's driven by alignment, it persists without strain. This is why sustainable change often looks quieter than dramatic transformation. There is less force, but more continuity. Resistance fades not because challenges disappear, but because the system no longer interprets them as threats to identity or outcome. Energy that was previously spent bracing is now available for adaptation. The result is not passivity, but responsiveness. At this level, influence becomes indirect but powerful. You are no longer pushing reality into shape. You are moving in a way that allows outcomes to organize naturally around you. Cause and effect remain intact, but the path between them becomes smoother. This is the transition from managing life to participating in it intelligently. Where effort decreases, clarity increases, and where clarity stabilizes, results follow without being chased. When this state becomes familiar, influence stops feeling like something you apply and starts feeling like something you express. There is a shift in identity that happens quietly. You no longer relate to yourself as someone trying to change circumstances, but as someone whose internal state is already shaping how circumstances unfold. This doesn't mean emotional fluctuations disappear. Doubt, frustration, and fatigue still arise. The difference is they no longer define the system. They move through without reorganizing your behavior around them. The baseline holds. And the baseline is what determines trajectory. From here, consistency matters more than intensity. Short bursts of motivation followed by collapse don't move much. Stable alignment, even at a moderate level, compounds over time. This is why lasting change often looks unremarkable day to day, but dramatic in retrospect. Living from this place alters how you interact with the world. You listen more accurately. You speak with less excess. You act when action is required and pause when it isn't. There is less urgency to prove, convince, or force outcomes. That reduction in internal noise makes you easier to respond to, both socially and situationally. What others often describe as presence is really coherence made visible. People feel it not because of charisma or technique, but because there is little contradiction in your signals. Your words, posture, and timing match. That consistency creates trust, even without explanation. At this stage, effort is replaced by calibration. You pay attention to what destabilizes you and what restores balance, not to avoid challenge, but to prevent unnecessary depletion. The goal is not constant expansion, but sustainable clarity. Change continues, but it no longer feels dramatic. It feels appropriate. You're not chasing a different life. You're refining how you meet the one in front of you, and that refinement naturally alters what becomes available next. This is where the idea of manifestation becomes less useful. There's nothing to summon. There's only alignment to maintain. Outcomes follow not because you demanded them, but because the system you're operating from makes certain outcomes more likely. At this point, life feels less like a struggle against randomness and more like an ongoing feedback process. You adjust, reality responds, and the loop becomes collaborative rather than adversarial. This is not an endpoint, it's a stable way of moving forward. Over time, this way of operating changes how you interpret cause and effect. You stop looking for dramatic turning points and start noticing subtle shifts in timing, access, and response. Things don't suddenly become perfect, but they become more precise. Less is wasted. Fewer actions need to be corrected. The system learns faster because it isn't overloaded. What once felt like effort now feels like positioning. You place yourself in situations that match your internal state, and those situations tend to return feedback that reinforces it. This isn't circular reasoning, it's adaptive behavior. When perception sharpens, choices improve. When choices improve, outcomes follow with less resistance. Another change becomes noticeable here. Patience stops feeling like delay. When alignment is stable, waiting doesn't create anxiety. You understand that not all movement is visible and not all progress is immediate. This prevents premature action, which is often what disrupts momentum in the first place. You also become less reactive to contrast. Setbacks no longer feel like reversals of identity or proof that something isn't working. They're processed as information. The system updates, recalibrates, and continues. This keeps direction intact, even when conditions fluctuate. At this level, influence becomes quiet. You're not broadcasting intention, you're embodying it. There's no internal debate about whether you deserve certain outcomes or whether they're possible. The question simply doesn't arise. Possibility is assumed, and assumption guides behavior more powerfully than motivation ever could. This internal neutrality creates space for better decisions, space for more accurate perception, space for others to meet you without friction. Opportunities that once required force now require recognition. Importantly, this isn't detachment from life. It's deeper engagement without entanglement. You're involved but not consumed, present but not pressured. That balance keeps the system responsive instead of rigid. When this becomes your default, life doesn't feel like something to conquer or decode. It feels like something you're in conversation with. You act, it responds, and the exchange remains fluid. From here, progress is less about pushing forward and more about staying aligned. And alignment, once established, does most of the work for you. Eventually, the distinction between internal work and external life begins to dissolve. You're no longer switching between practice mode and real life. The way you think, move, decide, and respond is the practice. Alignment isn't something you return to. It's something you carry. This is where many people misunderstand influence. They imagine it as something active, something applied at the right moment. In reality, influence at this level is passive but constant. It's embedded in how you show up. Your timing improves, not because you plan better, but because you're listening more accurately. Your decisions land cleaner because they aren't competing with internal resistance. There's also a noticeable shift in identity. You stop defining yourself by outcomes in progress. Success and failure lose their emotional charge. They become data points, not verdicts. This stabilizes your behavior in a way ambition alone never could. You keep moving, not because you're chasing a future version of yourself, but because movement itself feels coherent. This state changes how pressure works. External demands may increase, but internal pressure decreases. You don't rush to meet expectations, nor do you resist them. You respond proportionally. This keeps energy conserved and direction intact, even in complex situations. Another subtle change appears here. Trust in your own perception. You second-guess less, not because you're always right, but because you're no longer fragmented. When perception, emotion, and action align, confidence emerges naturally. It's not bravado, it's internal agreement. From the outside, this can look like ease or luck. From the inside, it feels like clarity. You're no longer negotiating with yourself at every step. That reduction in internal negotiation frees attention for what actually matters. At this stage, life doesn't feel controlled or surrendered. It feels coordinated. You're not directing everything, and you're not drifting either. You're participating from a stable center. This is what it means to live as the signal, rather than manage it. Not by effort, not by force, but by remaining internally consistent as circumstances change around you. When this consistency holds, the relationship with change itself transforms. Change is no longer something you prepare for or brace against. It becomes a natural extension of movement. Because the internal state remains stable, external shifts don't register as disruptions, only as new information entering the system. You begin to notice that fewer decisions feel urgent. Not because nothing matters, but because clarity removes panic. When perception is steady, you can distinguish between what requires action and what will resolve on its own. This prevents unnecessary interference and preserves momentum. At this level, effort is guided by context rather than emotion. You respond to what's actually happening, not to what you fear might happen. This keeps behavior proportional and effective. Small actions create outsized effects because they're timed correctly. There's also a deeper sense of autonomy that emerges. Not independence from others, but independence from internal compulsion. You no longer act to relieve anxiety, seek validation, or escape discomfort. Actions are chosen, not driven. This alone reshapes outcomes more than any strategy. What people often call flow is simply this state becoming sustained. Attention is absorbed, the body is responsive, and the mind is quiet enough to register subtle cues. Nothing feels forced, yet progress continues. The system is working with reality rather than against it. Over time, this creates a quiet confidence, not the kind that announces itself, but the kind that doesn't need reassurance. You trust your capacity to adjust, not your ability to predict. That trust keeps you open when conditions shift, instead of rigidly defending a plan that no longer fits. From here, the future stops feeling like something separate you're trying to reach. It's something you're already shaping through how you meet each moment. Direction is set less by goals and more by alignment. This is where influence becomes effortless, not because nothing is required of you, but because what you do is no longer diluted by internal conflict. At this stage, the idea of getting there loses relevance. There is no finish line the system is moving toward, only a direction it continues to refine. Progress becomes iterative rather than dramatic, built through countless small adjustments that rarely announce themselves. You start to recognize that stability is not stagnation. It's what allows complexity to be handled without collapse. When the internal state is stable, you can engage with uncertainty, pressure, and novelty without losing coherence. This is what makes growth sustainable instead of episodic. Another shift becomes clear here. Motivation is no longer the driver. Motivation fluctuates by nature. Alignment doesn't. You act because action fits, not because you've talked yourself into it. This reduces burnout and eliminates the cycles of overexertion followed by withdrawal that define most attempts at change. Your relationship with outcomes also matures. Success doesn't inflate identity, and setbacks don't threaten it. Both are integrated as feedback. This keeps attention focused forward instead of trapped in self-evaluation. Energy stays available for adjustment rather than rumination. At this level, influence is distributed over time. You're not trying to produce immediate results, you're shaping conditions. And conditions, once shaped, tend to generate results on their own. This is why the changes you experience here are quieter but longer lasting. There's a sense of internal continuity that develops. You feel like the same person across different situations, not fragmented into roles or reactions. That continuity is what others often respond to. It creates reliability, not through predictability, but through consistency of presence. Life begins to feel less like a series of problems to solve and more like a system to navigate intelligently. You still encounter obstacles, but they're approached as variables, not threats. This keeps movement fluid. From here, the work is no longer about becoming someone else. It's about staying connected to the state that allows you to move forward without resistance. At this level, subtlety becomes the measure of effectiveness. You notice that the smallest shifts in posture, breath, or attention ripple outward in ways that once required effortful intervention. Influence isn't loud or forceful. It is present, precise, and self-reinforcing. Decisions arise naturally, not from urgency, but from alignment. You no longer debate internally about what should happen. The system itself produces guidance through clarity, timing, and resonance with the environment. Action becomes less about strategy and more about appropriateness. Your perception sharpens. You start seeing patterns in events, people, and opportunities that were invisible before. This is not mysticism. It is the result of a system that is coherent enough to detect nuance, process it efficiently, and respond without hesitation. Another noticeable change is emotional regulation. Fluctuations still occur, but they don't derail behavior. Tension, doubt, and discomfort pass through without redirecting energy. This internal stability increases the likelihood of consistent outcomes. Over time, life begins to mirror this internal state. Situations unfold in ways that feel less random, not because control has increased, but because the system itself is delivering consistent, intelligible feedback. The baseline you maintain becomes the template for what emerges. What used to feel like external pressure now feels like information to be processed. Opportunities appear aligned with your internal state rather than imposed from outside. You respond with timing and precision instead of reaction and urgency. At this stage, influence is quiet but undeniable. It's embedded in how you exist rather than what you do. Presence becomes the organizing principle, and the results follow naturally from it. This is where the practice of alignment moves from intentional exercise to way of being. Energy flows through you with less resistance, perception is accurate, and action is coherent. The field no longer needs to be forced. It responds because the system you operate from has already set the pattern. At this point, the distinction between effort and influence fades completely. You realize that the work isn't about pushing outcomes into reality, but about maintaining a system capable of producing them reliably. Alignment becomes the constant, not the variable, and it informs every thought, feeling, and action without requiring conscious oversight. You notice a new relationship with time. The pressure to act immediately diminishes because the system anticipates and responds appropriately. Opportunities and challenges present themselves at the right moment, and your responses feel neither hurried nor delayed. Movement becomes precise, measured, and effortless. Internal clarity deepens. The mind, body, and emotions operate with minimal interference. This reduces wasted energy and increases responsiveness. You no longer oscillate between urgency and inaction. Instead, Each moment is met with an appropriate level of engagement. Your interactions with others also shift. People sense consistency and reliability in presence, not in achievement. Influence becomes relational, subtle, and self-reinforcing. Conversations, collaborations, and decisions unfold with less friction because the system projecting them is stable and coherent. At this stage, feedback from the environment is absorbed without disruption. Setbacks are interpreted as information, not judgment. Success is a natural reflection of alignment, not a source of identity inflation. Energy once devoted to self-monitoring is now available for perception, adaptation, and calibrated action. Life no longer feels like a series of obstacles to overcome, but as a dynamic system to navigate intelligently. Complexity is handled with fluidity rather than force. You're no longer reacting to reality, you're participating in it in a way that continuously shapes outcomes. This is where influence becomes embedded in existence itself. It is quiet, consistent, and cumulative. Actions are not forced, and yet results accumulate naturally because the internal system generating them has reached a level of coherence that external circumstances cannot ignore. As internal alignment deepens, the distinction between intention and experience fades. Action and outcome no longer feel like separate forces. They become reflections of your inner state. Every movement, decision, and choice carries the essence of this alignment, and the world responds accordingly. You begin to notice that even the slightest internal shifts, whether in breath, posture, or focus, are enough to influence how situations unfold. Influence ceases to be about exerting effort. It becomes about being more in tune with your own coherence. Expectations no longer feel imposed from the outside. They rise naturally from within the system itself. There is no longer a need to force outcomes or convince reality to bend to your preferences. Instead, you become a quiet observer, responding and remaining aligned, while opportunities and synchronicities unfold effortlessly. Though emotions still arise, they no longer disrupt your actions. Doubt, fatigue, and tension pass through without influencing your choices. Internal consistency becomes the foundation of your experience, shaping external events more reliably than any strategy or effort could. Decision-making becomes second nature. You react to what is, not what might be. With the internal noise quieted, your perception sharpens, and small, deliberate actions replace constant corrections or interventions. Life shifts from a series of obstacles to a fluid exchange with a responsive system. You take action, the system responds, and feedback loops naturally reinforce alignment. There is no struggle to impose order. Order emerges from the natural coherence you cultivate. This is the point where mastery transcends technique. Influence is no longer something you try to exert. It becomes the effortless outcome of your inner state. The system moves in harmony with you, and you expend no energy fighting against it. Here, alignment becomes a way of life. Every choice, every interaction, every moment flows from coherence, creating a self-sustaining cycle where outcomes unfold naturally from the state you maintain. As the journey deepens, the line between effort and outcome fades into insignificance. Influence no longer stems from exertion, persuasion, or control. It arises effortlessly from the harmony of your internal state. Your presence carries its own weight because it is aligned, and that alignment naturally organizes everything around you. Perception becomes increasingly acute. You begin to notice the subtleties in timing, tone, and context that once went unnoticed. The system you now operate from is finely attuned to even the smallest shifts in circumstance, enabling you to respond with precision rather than reacting impulsively. Emotions still arise, but they no longer govern your actions. Tension, doubt, or discomfort pass through without disrupting your decisions. This newfound stability allows energy to be directed with clarity, free from internal conflict or compensatory effort. Decision-making becomes a natural extension of your being. You no longer act in opposition to the flow of the system, but in accordance with it. Choices emerge effortlessly, perfectly aligned with both context and intention. As your internal coherence strengthens, guidance becomes clearer and mental effort diminishes. Life shifts into a continuous dialogue. Events unfold in response to your state, and feedback loops enhance your coherence rather than challenging it. External circumstances lose their chaotic feel, for your internal system is now calibrated to interpret and respond with intelligence. Even the smallest adjustments, whether in posture, breath, or focus, carry an impact far beyond their surface appearance. Influence builds steadily over time, quietly accumulating without the need for constant effort or dramatic intervention. This is where mastery evolves from action to presence. The field no longer requires pushing or persuasion. It responds naturally to the state you cultivate. Your role shifts from managing outcomes to maintaining coherence and allowing events to align themselves. At this point, life unfolds with clarity and rhythm. You are present, responsive, and aligned. Outcomes emerge consistently, not because you force them, but because you have become the signal that the system recognizes and responds to. At this stage, the internal system itself becomes the primary source of guidance. You no longer rely on external cues, pressure, or constant planning to determine action. Alignment generates clarity that informs each choice effortlessly, and timing becomes intuitive rather than calculated. Small shifts in attention, breath, or posture now ripple outward, producing effects that previously required deliberate effort. Influence is no longer about forcing results. It arises naturally from coherence. Every movement, word, and decision carries the imprint of internal stability. Emotional fluctuations continue, but they no longer hijack action. Tension, doubt, or discomfort may pass through, but they do not disrupt the baseline. Energy is conserved and directed toward meaningful engagement rather than internal correction. Patterns in life start to feel intelligible rather than random. Opportunities, synchronicities, and favorable circumstances appear with a clarity that matches your internal state. Events respond to coherence rather than demand. Your presence becomes a quiet force. Others sense it without explanation, and situations align around it without intervention. The need to prove, control, or manipulate outcomes diminishes because the system projecting signals is already stable and intelligible. Life no longer feels like a struggle. It feels like a conversation in which your internal state participates actively, shaping responses and organizing circumstances naturally. Actions are precise, perception is accurate, and feedback reinforces coherence instead of creating tension. This is where the practice of alignment transcends technique. Influence becomes embedded in being rather than doing. Outcomes follow not because of effort, but because the system generating them has reached a level of stability and integrity that reality can respond to effortlessly. Consistency now becomes the backbone of influence. You no longer rely on moments of intensity or bursts of effort to shape outcomes. Instead, the steady maintenance of your internal state produces effects over time that accumulate quietly but powerfully. Subtle cues, how you breathe, how you hold attention, how you embody expectation, begin to orchestrate circumstances without conscious intervention. Actions become more precise because they emerge from a system that is coherent, calibrated, and responsive. Feedback loops tighten. The outcomes you experience are increasingly a reflection of internal alignment rather than external pressure. Challenges are processed efficiently, and patterns reveal themselves clearly because the system is free from internal contradictions that once obscured them. Decision-making becomes effortless. Responses are timely, proportionate, and accurate. You no longer overthink or second-guess. The internal coherence itself generates guidance for when and how to act. Presence evolves into the dominant form of influence. People, opportunities, and situations respond not to persuasion or strategy, but to the stability and clarity embedded in your state. The subtle force of coherence organizes interactions naturally. Life feels increasingly intelligible. You sense the structures underlying events, rather than reacting to apparent randomness. The system you inhabit mediates experience, allowing movement and adjustment to happen fluidly. Here, influence is sustainable and self-reinforcing. It no longer requires constant monitoring or deliberate effort. Your internal alignment carries the weight of effect, and outcomes emerge reliably as a natural consequence of the system you maintain. Now, all of these layers converge into a single principle. You become the signal, not the negotiator. Effort, struggle, and chasing fade because the system you operate from inherently produces clarity, coherence, and alignment. Your presence alone begins to shape circumstances, timing, and interactions in ways that feel effortless yet precise. The world responds to stability more than to intensity. Small, consistent expressions of internal alignment ripple outward, producing effects that were once thought to require force or constant intervention. Every choice, every breath, every posture contributes to the ongoing orchestration of outcomes. Setbacks, doubt, or discomfort may still appear, but they no longer dictate the system. The baseline coherence remains dominant, guiding perception, action, and timing naturally. Energy that was previously spent correcting, overthinking, or resisting is now available for meaningful engagement and response. Opportunities, synchronicities, and patterns emerge in alignment with your internal state rather than by chance. Life begins to feel less like something to manage and more like a conversation you are participating in intelligently. Cause and effect no longer feel fragmented. They flow seamlessly through your coherence. This is the ultimate expression of influence. Quiet, cumulative, and self-reinforcing. You are not forcing outcomes, controlling reality, or proving anything. You are maintaining a state from which outcomes naturally unfold. Presence, stability, and alignment have replaced effort, struggle, and chasing. Living this way transforms your experience. You move through life as the embodied signal, consistently shaping circumstances without conscious struggle. Life responds because the system you maintain is coherent, integrated, and unmistakably aligned with what you intend to manifest. This is the point where mastery becomes being, not technique, not ritual, but sustained alignment that allows influence, clarity, and opportunity to emerge naturally, effortlessly, and reliably.